Welcome to Berlin Briefing. Today we're unpacking a diplomatic shockwave. Germany, the UN's second largest funder, a country that has served on the Security Council 6 times, lost its bid for another seat this week. This is the diplomatic equivalent of Bayern Munich not making it into the Champions League, or if you're listening from North America, the New England Patriots missing the playoffs. It just doesn't happen. And to set the scene, let's take you straight to the General Assembly Hall on Wednesday.
Number of votes obtained, Portugal, 134. Austria, 131. Germany, 104.
So Portugal got in, as did Austria, not so Germany. We'll take you behind the scenes and we'll explain why it happened, why it matters, what Israel, Russia and the US have got to do with it, and what all of this means for the future of German foreign policy. I have Max Hofmann with me, fellow podcast host who's been following the speed dating trips that the German foreign minister has been undertaking for the last couple of weeks. So glad to have you here with us, Max. And also on the line is Myriel Marthez, who joins us. She's a doctoral researcher with the Peace Research Institute and an expert on the workings of the United Nations. Let's start with you and with the basics. Can you just walk us through, Myriel, what exactly happened?
So the Security Council seats that are up for election, there are 10 seats that are elected every second year, and there's 5 seats that are belonging to the permanent members, so the P5. And 2 of the seats, they belong to the regional group of Western and European states, and 2 of these seats were up for election. And Germany was competing together with Austria and Portugal for these seats that are up for the next period of 27 and 28, so for the next years. And what happened is that Germany put its hat in the ring in 2020, while Portugal and Austria already announced their candidacy in 2011 and 2013. So at the vote of the General Assembly, where each state has 1 vote, Germany actually lost the vote and did not get the sufficient 2/3 majority to actually get a seat. And the thing is that what makes this very, very important is that it already lost this in the first round of elections. While in other previous situations, there were several rounds of elections, but not in this one. So Germany actually in the first round, they had we can call it a massive defeat. Yeah.
Okay, so Max, Austria won decisively, as Myriel just said. Some people had hoped that it would get into a second round. This is a secret ballot, though. So is it possible that even Germany's closest allies went against Germany there?
I'm still hung up on the New England Patriots that you mentioned in the beginning. They have not made the playoffs every year, but Johann Wadephul wasn't the equivalent of Tom Brady, the legendary New England Patriots quarterback in this situation.
Sorry, as you can tell, American sports not
I would like to talk
expertise.
about sports, not about is that possible? No. All right. So we just don't know. That's the bottom line, because it's a secret vote, and some diplomats, some ambassadors at the United Nations might even tell you afterwards, we voted for you, we're really sorry it didn't work, but maybe it didn't vote for you, or there are also cases where certain diplomats have pledged their vote over the years to all 3 parties of the Western Europe and other countries bloc, which is the bloc where Germany is represented in that bloc. has 2 seats. And so that's why one of them couldn't make it, in this case, Germany. There are stories around the United Nations of how the different countries and representatives votes that seriously boggle the mind. Some of those diplomats apparently don't even follow the orders from their home country. They just decide on their own who they like and who they don't like. There's also a joke going around that the Austrians just had the better parties than the other countries. I wouldn't go that far because it's a serious business after all. And I would assume that most countries there are very serious about who they want on the Security Council. But it's just to show you it's such a varied field with such different interests. Every country has its interests. Then there's the representatives that might have their own agenda and all that. So afterwards, it's really hard to say. But we do think, I assume we're going to talk about this later. Of course, a very solid assumption here, Germany's foreign policy over the last year does play a role. We hope so, at least, in determining whether other countries want them on the Security Council or not.
Yeah, I want to go through all of those reasons that we're now hearing from German politicians why it didn't work out this time. Because this is, of course, very early stages of wound licking. And there are essentially, I've identified 5, maybe both of you have more. One was that Germany did too little too late. Myriel already touched on that, right? So Austria started campaigning way earlier. Then also there's the reason that Russia campaigned against Germany because of Germany's stance when it comes to Ukraine. And then Israel. Reason number 4, Germany is seen as defending international law only when it's convenient. So, not lecturing the US when it comes to essentially the Iran war. And then there's this underlying perception of German arrogance that people just assumed it was going to happen. So let's break that down. We already talked about Germany doing too little too late. Max, just take us behind the scenes. What exactly did Johann Wadephul do to try and catch up?
Yeah, too little, too late. I mean, too little in the last weeks. You can't really say that, at least from the perspective of the German foreign minister. He was in New York from last Thursday, so basically staying in one place for 1 week.
Very unusual, right?
Very unusual. And he had a tour where I was at the end of April also. I think he met with well over 100 ministers and representatives of state, so the diplomats on site. So he really... And it was impressive also to be there, to see that schedule, which is really by the minute. And the workload he has, also very impressive. You could argue it's too late on the scale of the UN, going into the race in 2019, when the 2 other countries declared years before that. I always wondered, does it really make such a difference? Because governments change in the meantime, pledges change. Is it really such a disadvantage? I'm not so sure. But yeah, of course, later than the others, so it might have been too late. I think Germany's stance in foreign policy plays a bigger role there. Because
okay, let's keep that for now. But Myriel, you worked at the UN, right? So how important is that to be consistent with that campaign? Or is it something that is now being given as a reason for why it didn't work, that Germany's candidacy was announced quite late this time round? But really, it doesn't matter that much at what time you announce your candidacy.
I think there are several things that are relevant for this. So first, Germany announces candidacy right after it just had non-permanent seat in the Security Council. That was 3 governments ago, so there's a lot that has happened kind of in between. Generally, it's not very well looked at the UN if you announce your candidacy while you're still in the entity that you want to reapply to be a candidate for again. So this is why it actually came so late, kind of as a contextualizing a bit to understand why it actually announced it so late. The other aspect is that the other 2 countries, they've obviously announced it way before. They also were only 3 times on the Security Council, whereas Germany has already had a seat for 6 times. And Germany has this kind of self-declared goal to be on the Security Council every 8 years. So in order to be there every 8 years, they obviously have to kind of be a candidate just shortly after they just had a seat, because you can only be a candidate on the Security Council every 6 periods. So this is it's a bit of conundrum that Germany is facing in terms of when best to apply. But I think the fact that the other two countries kind of announced it way earlier, and then Germany comes in and says, like, we also want a seat, then they perhaps don't do the amount of campaigning that they should have done, or that they perhaps could have done if the political will would have been sufficiently behind it, especially in the last year. That kind of adds up to perhaps also a bit of not very well received within the General Assembly and among the states, kind of that this German attitude of coming in like we're one of the biggest donor states to the UN, we should have a seat. Also, we applied for it like a few years ago, but then, I mean, we are one of the biggest donors and we have this goal to be there every 8 years. That is a bit, I think this mix of things kind of leads to a certain perception of Germany, perhaps that was not very beneficial in this case. And the international law is another story that we have to unpack. Definitely.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit. First, I want to have your opinion on that theory that Russia actively campaigned against Germany. I mean, Russia is, of course, being called out as the aggressor when it comes to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the war that has been going on for more than 4 years there now. And can you describe what kind of an influence Russia wields at the UN? It is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, after all.
Yeah. So I think one of the main issues at the Security Council that we have at the moment is that we have the permanent members who have a veto right. So every time a resolution comes up for election, these P5s, so this is Russia, China, the UK, France, and the US, they have the opportunity to veto a resolution which directly puts the resolution to dust. It can't proceed after this. So Russia obviously has one veto, and it has, on the issue of Ukraine, consistently vetoed these resolutions. So it hasn't been possible for the Security Council to pass any resolution on Ukraine within the last 3 years. And the same is true for the US when it comes to the war in Gaza, so with respect to anything that kind of is concerned with Israel. And that's why we're speaking of a blockade of the Security Council. So obviously, these big powers, they don't have an interest to have a non-permanent member enter the Security Council that, by its own agenda or perhaps its own geopolitical interests, is kind of opposed to their own. So Russia would like to have a member that is perhaps more open towards having a different approach on the war on Ukraine, while the US would perhaps favor Germany's stance when it comes to Israel. So there's definitely an interest of Russia to not have Germany on the council. There's also these rumors that the German ambassador who represented Germany in the last Security Council session was obviously very vocal about human rights issues, about the Eastern Ukrainian war that was already going on then. So I would say there's a combination of issues. But yeah, Russia might have played a role. How big that was, I'm not able to assess. I think that's perhaps more well-known in diplomatic circles.
Okay, so that brings us now to the question of, Myriel already touched on that, on the thorny issue of Germany's stance when it comes to Israel. Max?
Yeah, that, we know that this is a big issue for many countries from the so-called global south. And when I was with Johann Wadephul, the German foreign minister in New York City, you could tell that he was focusing a lot on countries from the African group. Not exclusively, but at least then there was a lot going on there, because there were hopes that maybe some of those countries could be won over, despite, I might say, Germany's support for Israel. Johann Wadephul himself also mentioned that in his statement after the vote yesterday, that he knows that this could have played a role.
Maybe we can just listen to that.
Historically, Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Let's just listen to Johann Wadephul's reaction when he himself tried to unpick the reasons why it didn't work.
It also may have cost us votes that Germany must always assume a special responsibility for Israel with regard to the Middle East conflict. We will continue to live up to our historical responsibility, even if at the time we criticize specific policies of the current government.
Okay, Max.
Germany has a historical responsibility that is acknowledged in most parties in Germany and in this government, definitely also. And this wasn't a problem for many years, but it became a real problem when the war in Gaza started. And I think, partly at least, we're seeing the
war in Gaza that followed essentially Hamas's attack on October the 7th. Yeah,
exactly. And so this is certainly part of this brew, if you want to call it like that. You know, I think, as Myriel pointed out, it's a mix of things. And it's really, you can identify some big trends that have contributed, but it's really hard to say for each and every member state. And there's nothing you can say which applies to each and every member state. But yes, this comes up a lot, and this definitely played a role.
And this is also something, Myriel, yeah, exactly. I wanted to take that to you because last year at the UN, there was a big Palestine conference that was organized by France, which is traditionally one of Germany's closest allies. And a lot of countries last year recognized Palestine as a sovereign state. Germany did not. Also, in that same period, the German Chancellor didn't turn up to the UN General Assembly meeting, while Austria brought along, everybody and their cat to attend those important meetings. How important is that, and how personally do UN diplomats take this if the German Chancellor doesn't show up, but Austria brings the president, etc.?
I think from my understanding of diplomacy, and perhaps also how it works, if we look into the academic world that kind of research this diplomacy, personal relations are a big part of this. And it's not only the direct personal relation that you have with your interlocutor when you discuss something at the negotiation table, is also, there's a lot of discussion about rank and hierarchies as well. So who do you bring to what table has an impact on the result that you're able to achieve. So at this size of a conference and this kind of high level, it's really important to also bring in high level people within your own government or within your diplomatic ranks. So at a conference like this, to not turn up with your heads of government or heads of state, that is a sign that perhaps points into a direction where Germany could have kind of reconsidered what sign they want to send, which is that's one part of the issue. The other issue is that they still haven't recognized Palestine, which is also politically an issue. But also something I would like to kind of add to the Israel question is it's not only about Israel, it's about Germany's stance on international law. And that is directly connected to the question of Israel, so to the war in Gaza, and Germany having kind of repeatedly evaded questions about condemnations, about legal questions as well. But it's also how they kind of have their stance on international law when it comes to themselves. So Germany was brought before the International Court of Justice, I think, by South Africa. So there is a case going on where Germany is accused of kind of being complicit in genocide. There's an arrest warrant
because of arms exports to Israel.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, that have been continuing throughout the years of the war. And there's also the arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu, where the German government never explicitly said that they will actually follow up on this, even though they signed the international law paper that kind of binds them to complying with these warrants. So states observe this. States look at German foreign policy and they see that although it presents itself as kind of a defender, and that was also one of the kind of main missions that they set out for the time in the Security Council is that they would defend international law. But then at the same time, if you look at the foreign policy, it actually doesn't look that way. Germany only complies with international law and kind of defends it when it speaks to their own agenda. But the moment there's kind of a critical point where the own interest or perhaps the own values or how you might perceive whatever, like the historic responsibility towards Israel, the moment that diverges from international law, we set back the international law and we decide to kind of go with our own position. And that is a big issue. And that is seen especially by smaller states who are deeply reliant on adherence to international law. Yeah.
And that selective interpretation of when to uphold international law and, when not to do so explicitly, that is, of course, something that has been criticized here in Germany as well by lots of political groups. I was just wondering, Myriel, because you were working at the United Nations in Geneva last year, is there also the possibility that, UN diplomats, you just said how important those personal relationships are, that UN diplomats didn't like the fact that former German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock essentially snatched away a job that a well-respected German diplomat had wanted for a very long time. Helga Schmidt was a name that many people said was going to be the next president of the UN General Assembly. I mean, these things are maybe not, they don't make the major headlines, but Annalena Baerbock said, look, I'm no longer foreign minister, so I deserve an important position. I want to be the president of the UN General Assembly. How much was that a topic of discussion in the corridors when you were working at the UN?
So I worked at UNDP, so I didn't work in the secretariat. And I think, to be honest, we were so occupied with all the reform discussions, with the really harsh financial cuts that had direct impacts on our work, that these topics were not discussed at all. Especially, and that's perhaps another issue we can discuss, because Germany at the UN, in terms of its direct appearance, specifically where I was working, wasn't so relevant. So most of our donors were Japan, for example. And I think that's kind of the people you directly work with within your respective organization. And in my case, that was development work. The direct relation to your donors is way more important than to other countries in that case. And so we didn't discuss that. Yeah.
But funding is a crucial point, right, Max, for for the United Nations. And Germany has always said, especially now that the US is withdrawing, from international multilateral organizations and Donald Trump wants to make more deals, Germany has become the second most important donor. So, why was that not a successful enough pledge, do you think? What was Johann Wadephul's explanation?
It's an argument that Wadephul used a lot, and also that was part of the arguments we heard, in the circles of the foreign ministry a lot. I think it's honored at the UN. I'm not, I'm in Berlin, so I'm not involved in the inner proceedings of the United Nations anymore as much as I used to be. I do think people see that, respect that, and but it just wasn't enough in this international environment that we have at the moment, in this German, you would say, Gemengelage, so in this mix of things, in this brew of things. That's all I can really say. If we pinpoint different reasons here, I can only repeat myself, I'm sorry about that, is that it's really hard to define afterwards what really played a role here. And I think what's also to remember, you're always smarter afterwards, right? Had you asked me yesterday, is Germany going to make it? I'd said there's a pretty good chance they're going to make it. And that was also the buzz we were getting from the German delegation. Now, of course, today everybody smart said, of course, they didn't make it because of the international situation, because the support for Israel, because of the support for Ukraine. But we tend to forget that this is we look at history through the rear view mirror. And yesterday, many experts who say that today would have said something different yesterday. And nobody, I think, well, maybe, the people that are really involved in the inner workings, but not a lot of people saw this kind of defeat coming, because it is a significant defeat. 104 votes. They're shy 25 votes. That's a lot. And you could see on the faces of Wadephul and his staff, they were really disappointed because they always said it was going to be tight. They weren't naive, but I don't think they expected a vote like that.
Myriel, what would you say? Were Germans just naive to expect to get into the UN Security Council? How was that position? How did other countries see the likelihood of Germany getting in?
I mean, it has worked 6 times before. I mean, obviously there were reasons that kind of could have indicated that it wouldn't work, but I don't think there were very strong signs that it was kind of to be expected that Germany didn't get in. I think this aspect of financing also has to do with this kind of German self-understanding and position within the UN. So we are the second largest donor. Yeah, but we're also economically one of the strongest countries in the world. So it's kind of logical that we would contribute more to a multilateral organization where essentially we're benefiting from as well. But to kind of rely on that and this would directly kind of give us the possibility, or it should enable us to also be at the Security Council. I think that kind of thinking is also what is often criticized when we talk about the great powers in the P5 in the Security Council. So perhaps a bit more humility would have done Germany quite well, or would have served it well, to also approach countries on an eye-to-eye level and really to understand what their position is and what they would want, without just looking at us. Because if we have a seat on the Security Council, we're representing a lot of countries, and we're responsible for bringing in the different opinions from these countries, but also to stand up for others. And I don't think that Germany has done this enough and has shown enough that they would do that, especially for smaller countries, for countries that don't have such a big voice. And I think perhaps that was kind of we've received that feedback now. Perhaps we should take it. Yeah.
I think those are important points. My perception of Wadephul himself is a bit more, I wouldn't say nuanced, but I think it's a bit unfair to say that he's somebody who talks down to other people. That's
I wouldn't say that.
I know, but it's kind of like, should more on eye level and all that. I hear you, that, and if that's the perception, I absolutely respect that. What I saw is that they were trying to do that, and they were not trying to just get in on the money ticket. That's my perception. If you look at and you know that better than I do, Myriel, right? But if you look at the history of what Germany has done in the Security Council in the past years, they gave smaller countries a voice, especially when it came to topics like climate change, for example. And so I think that perception of Germany just trying to do everything through the money they have is a bit outdated. I don't think that that's really the reality. Where I'm on board is they should have taken this more seriously, maybe on different levels also. I think the foreign minister took it very seriously, but the points you made about the German chancellor not showing up to the General Assembly last year, and although he was involved, but probably not as much as he should have been involved. And there, I think there could be a perception where you say, okay, if this is not important enough for you to show up, then, and you think it's just going to work out anyway, although you don't put in, the public effort there, then okay. That, I think that, as you said, Myriel, earlier, that's a significant signal when it comes to that. But I do think Germany isn't, that arrogant country anymore which it was portrayed often. I don't think that's the case. Germany is very insecure at the moment on many levels. It's trying to find its role. It's trying to create a vision of what it wants to be in the future. I think if at all, there's kind of a mega trend that we're seeing all across elections in the world and also in Germany, that economy, the saying, it's the economy, stupid, it doesn't apply anymore in the way it used to. And it's about who do we want to be and what kind of values do we want to represent. And maybe that's also that it's a mega trend that we're also seeing at the UN.
That's definitely a very, very, very good discussion to have. And I think this is now basically day one of where Germany really has to sit down and try and do its homework. Myriel, let me just ask you to basically sum up. What would Germany need to do to make it into the UN Security Council next time? Which lessons does it have to learn now?
I think, and this links back to the previous discussion, this commitment to international law, commitment to the UN as institution, it's a crucial point. So Germany has kind of the Board of Peace that was proposed by Trump, but like as an alternative organization to the UN. Germany has never, with the vehemency that France, for example, put behind their statement, rejected that organization. And the Board of Peace is essentially made up to be the Security Council in an alternative version where you buy your way in. And it's a complete cut of multilateralism. And if you commit to the UN as an institution, you have to fundamentally reject the Board of Peace. And Germany hasn't done that. And I think this is kind of, we definitely have to work on our commitment to the UN, on our commitment to international law, and on our commitment to kind of uphold this, even though we lost these particular elections. And for the next elections, perhaps even these reasons that were mentioned that kind of are relevant in a way as well. So the late application, we might be able to work on that. We might be able to work on commitments towards different states, on cooperation. But I think this commitment to the UN as an institution is essential. Yeah.
And Max, your last thoughts, what does need to change when it comes to Germany's foreign policy so that the standing can be such that if Germany does decide to apply for a seat, that would then be open again in 2035, that would then be successful?
That's, of course, a discussion in itself, maybe something for future episodes of Berlin Briefing. I think it comes down to double standards. And that's what we're also seeing here when we produce our, reports and all that, and the comments on the digital platforms. People often saying, okay, Europe, but also Germany has double standards when it comes what they are doing and what they expect the rest of the world to do. And it seems to me this is becoming increasingly important. Integrity. For Germany, it's really hard to find that sweet spot, if I may, between integrity and also holding up those historical responsibilities that are undeniable, right? So how do you do that in a geopolitical situation like that? Probably easier with the United States, something we haven't really talked about, but that's also where some double standards became apparent because in the war in Iran, for example, and again, we could talk about this a long time, not clearly naming what was happening in Iran, where the U.S. obviously is instrumental. So I think that's something they could work on, right? But again, I'm saying this for the first time, but I think it's important to remember the German government, the German chancellor, and the German foreign minister are there for making sure, for acting in the interests of Germany, just like the U.S. does and all that. And I think, is that what they're doing in the best interest of Germany, even if it means not getting a seat on a paralyzed Security Council at the moment? That's something they have to consider. It's politics at the moment is not pretty. And if you really want to protect your country, a country that is as exposed as Germany, being connected globally so much, that's a hard thing to do. And it's hard to have complete integrity when something like that happens.
And I would probably add just one last thought that is an imminent thing, something that they can take on board instantly, is that they will have to work very closely together with Austria and Portugal, who, after all, have managed to secure a seat on the UN Security Council.
That's the goal always of the European Union. And that's why this was so unfortunate, because you have, in principle, you have 3 very close partners from the EU level once being pitted against each other. That was not fortunate.
Absolutely. So this brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you very much for watching. If you got this far, then you may also want to subscribe to our Berlin Briefing newsletter and leave us comments wherever you found us. Thank you very much to Myriel Marthez over at the Peace Research Institute for giving us all your insights from the workings of the United Nations, a body that Germany finds very, very important and is not alone in doing so. And Max Hofmann, fellow podcast host and foreign policy expert. Thank you very much.